Are you a leader, manager, entrepreneur, business owner, or knowledge worker? Are you leading people and wondering how to be a better leader in your own life and work? If you are, then you could be thinking about experimenting differently. Join us on the Experimental Leader podcast and take a look at the ways leaders are experimenting in their own lives. Hosted by Melanie Parrish and Mel Rutherford, we dive into real-life conversations about how people might be using a scientist mindset and experimenting in their work. Shift your leadership into something more innovative. Join us on the Experimental Leader podcast today.
Hi, I'm Melanie Parrish, and I am an executive coach, a content creator, an author, and I want to welcome you to the Experimental Leader podcast.
Hi, Melanie. I'm Mel Rutherford. I'm McMaster University's first transgender department chair. I'm the chair of psychology, neuroscience, and behavior, and I'm happy to be here today.
Well, it's great to have you. And we've been having people comment that we act like we don't know each other at the beginning of our podcast. So I should say we're also married and we love each other very much. And well, you have a really funny expression when
because I can say that I'm happy to see you today because you're in a different country than I am. So
I know it's true. It's great to see you too. And yeah, so what are you thinking about in leadership right now?
So one of the things that I really value in leadership and leading an organization is shared leadership that I articulate what roles people have, what leadership roles people have. I hand them their portfolio. I don't micromanage. I make sure that my department has a lot of leaders, a lot of people doing leadership in a lot of areas. And one of the recent strategies I've been employing in creating more shared leadership is to name the leadership that people are doing. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I had a few days ago, a graduate student came to my office and had some concerns, complaints, suggestions. We talked through what was happening and what was needed and what we could change going forward. And then I thanked him for his leadership because he was in fact providing leadership to the department. He was representing the graduate students and coming to talk to me. In another example, there were a faculty member came and had a minor conflict with another faculty member. And so I said, do you mind if I get in touch with that person? I got in touch with that person, explained the situation. Then I invited the two of them to work it out. The two of them went to coffee together. They came up with a solution. It works for everyone. And after that, I thanked them both for their leadership because in fact, they were providing leadership for the department. So by naming these activities as leadership, which they are, I'm making explicit that we're all sharing leadership in the department.
Oh, those are really cool examples. I love that. Well, I've been thinking about self-care a lot. And some of this is because through a set of circumstances, I ended up vacationing a lot in the last 2 months. So I was on 5 different trips in the last 2 months, which is why I'm never home and why Mel's happy to see me. And so a couple of things. One is like, I'm feeling the best I've felt probably in a decade. And some of it might be that my children have grown up and I'm having more time for myself and I'm not on the edge all the time parenting. But I've also just had some rest and some fun. And I think that leaders are often super depleted. And I think that it is I think it's just a state of being that we get used to. And so as I'm feeling really amazing, I also have I went on a cruise with a celebrity nutritionist and have committed to a year of better supplementation to really nourish my body and to really take care of myself deeply through nutrition and exercise. And it's working. I think for all the years that I was parenting, I would try these things and I wouldn't feel much of a change. But sort of because I had these opportunities to rest and then changing the nutrition, I feel so amazing. And And I don't know what it is for each leader, but I do want to be a voice that self-care is a huge part of leadership, that we have more to give. We respond better. We're less reactive when we do self-care, and sometimes deep self-care. And I think often um, somebody's first response to conflict or stress in the workplace is to reach for a martini. And I just want to be a voice for, going to the gym, maintaining self-care in challenging times as a leader, because I think it really adds to our reserves.
Yeah, I think leaders sometimes have a hard time finding somebody to reach out to help for because they're, it's lonely at the top. Uh, so yeah, self-care is a good strategy for leaders.
Yeah. I am super excited about our guest today. Our guest is Jane Mulkewich, and she's from Hamilton, Ontario, and she has had a varied career leading to her current position as a legal director for a large union. It's the UFCW Locals 175 and 633, and she leads a team of lawyers who are providing legal services to more than 70,000 workers. Jane's also a friend of ours, and she's one of the most read people I know. I am so excited to have her on our show. Jane, welcome to the program.
Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I am so excited to talk to you because I was thinking, wow, I'd like to know more about unions and the roles that they play. And I'm also curious about your role as a leader of lawyers working for a union. And I thought, well, what better way than to, put you on the spot and get you to answer a lot of questions. So we are so excited that you're here. Um, can you tell us a little bit about your journey as a lawyer?
Sure. I went to law school late in life. I'd already been working in various other jobs in the community. So I was in my 40s when I first went to law school, which was an interesting experience. I used to say it was like when you lived in a house for a very long time and finally you get to go down in the basement and you can see the foundations of everything that you've been familiar with. Like we were talking about in constitutional law, we talked about Brian Mulroney and the Meech Lake Accord. And unlike some of the students in class at that time, I had been a political activist during those years. Or we talked about marriage contracts and divorce, and I'd already been through one of those by the time I went to law school. Or we talked about Indigenous rights, and I had already worked as an activist on Indigenous rights issues, and so going to law school helped me to understand some of the origins and concepts in law that we lived in our society, that I'd already been active on a number of issues. So law school was really eye-opening for me in that sense. And so then from there, it was almost totally a matter of geography that I was looking for somewhere to article that was close by home, because at that point I had teenagers at home. I was a single mom of teenagers and I didn't want to commute to Toronto where a lot of the articling jobs were. So I ended up articling for Legal Aid Ontario in Milton, because they were the quickest growing community in Ontario at the time, Milton, and they needed an articling student in a new program. So I was doing family law and criminal law, and I did that for a while. And then when I became a lawyer, I worked in a very underserved area, which is Brantford, Ontario, which was crying out for lawyers, working mostly with Indigenous people who needed lawyers for family law and criminal law. And then again, a question of geography. A friend called me and said, how would you like to work in Dundas, which is where I live? And at that time, a major union, well, they still do, well, the Ontario Nurses Association, they had a regional office. Their Hamilton office is actually located in Dundas, so walking distance from my house. So I worked for ONA for a while for the nurses, and then went from there to UFCW. So UFCW is the second union I've worked for. So a large trajectory, and as I said, I'd done other kinds of community-oriented jobs, including a high-profile anti-racism role for the police in Hamilton before going to law school. I worked for doing a mental health project at a local community health center in Hamilton. And before that, I'd actually worked as a political staffer, as a constituency assistant for a local member of provincial parliament. So I've had varied roles, but when I put it all together to go to law school, I sort of made it seem like a seamless journey. But at the time, I was just going from one thing to the other.
I've tried to do that with my career too, to, in retrospect, make it look like it made sense.
Yeah, it may all make sense in the pursuit of justice or something. You think of some higher goal and you think, yes, that led me here to here to here.
Um,
That's
y-
really interesting, Jane. A while back we did a podcast about being a plaintiff as an activist. Melanie and I have been activists in various situations throughout our lives. I'm wondering if how being a lawyer either helps you in your activism, or are there any ways that being a lawyer sort of like puts parameters around what you can do as an activist?
Um, yeah, yes and no. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Sort of different parts of that question. Um, I would to that second part of the question about is there any limits it places on you? I suppose there are some lawyers who are willing to risk arrest and so on, but more usually lawyers in the activist movement are volunteering their services, or sometimes volunteering or sometimes paid, I guess, but to represent people who may be putting themselves on the line and risking arrest. So I know that every time there's an action of some kind going out, there's usually a call for lawyers, who will be available for bail services or, anything like that for someone who's risking arrest. So that is one way, a very concrete and specific way that a lawyer can contribute. So yeah, I think that learning about the law informs a sense of or can inform your activism, but the other way around too, that learning about activism has informed the kind of lawyer that I want to be. And law is very varied. You have corporate lawyers, you have human rights and union lawyers, you have, criminal defense lawyers and people working on the other side, working for the prosecutor. So it's very hard to generalize about, how people use law in the legal system. But I think that's how I see it, as a tool. It's one tool that can get you where you're going. And it's like any tool, even within the law, there are multiple tools. I have conversations all the time, that if someone is having an issue in the workplace, let's say harassment, what are the various options? If they're in a unionized environment, they can file a grievance. They can also go to the Human Rights Tribunal. They can also, there's provisions now, you can go an occupational health and safety route through the Minister of Labor. You can also go criminal harassment and lay police charges. There's a number of legal tools that you can use to solve the same problem. And sometimes it's really helpful to be familiar with what those tools are, to have the pros and cons and choose the best one.
I think that's really interesting to think of them as tools.
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. Let's talk about unions for a minute. Let's talk about your union. I mean, might as well talk about your union. If I were to, Seth Godin has a question about lots of things, which I really like, which is, what's it for? So what's your union for?
Sure. Well, any union in Ontario anyways has exclusive bargaining rights. In other words, if you belong to a union, it's because that union has negotiated an agreement with your employer that they have exclusive bargaining rights. So you no longer have an individual contract with that employer. That everything you do, like your rate of pay, your breaks, everything is negotiated by the union and not by you as an individual. Like, I'll give you an example. When my son came home from a summer job he had once, I don't need to get into details, but he said, like, oh, if I work nights, like from whatever time it was, from this time to this time, I get a premium pay. I said, oh, you're unionized then. And he goes, well, how did you know? It's like, because that's what unions do. They negotiate things like premiums for the night shift. So so they do that, but plus when you do belong to a union, you pay union dues, but there's so much value added for those union dues. For example, it pays for me, so that when you get into trouble at work, you don't need to go out and hire a lawyer and say, I'm going to file a lawsuit and pay money out of your own pocket. You have a lawyer that's paid for, in fact, a whole team of lawyers that's paid for by your union dues, and you don't have to pay me a cent. I will go and represent you. Usually the companies do have to hire lawyers. Most companies don't have in-house lawyers, but the union does. So the company is going to be very reticent about going to arbitration because they have to spend money on lawyers. Me, I get paid the same whether I go to arbitration or not. So I'm not afraid to take a case to arbitration and push as hard as we need to push for our members. And all of that is paid for out of your union dues. So it gives you more bargaining power in terms of wage rates, and in terms of all kinds of human rights, like, you know, if you are being harassed at work, those kinds of things, to have a better working conditions. And if there's something that happens to you, like maybe you, you know, did something which you now regret, but you've been disciplined for it or terminated from your job, even if you've done something wrong, your union is still there to represent you and give you the best representation that they can, even if it just means negotiating a good severance package for you or whatever it may be. So as a lawyer for a union, we do a vast array of work, everything from looking at individual, you know, grievances for someone who's been disciplined or terminated, to policy kinds of things. Like, we were very busy during the COVID pandemic about working conditions, you know, about policies, about vaccinations, about things like everything the employer was trying to do, like they would change shift schedules and things like that to accommodate the pandemic. But once you have a collective agreement, you can't make any of those changes without consulting the union, because it's a negotiated working condition, right?
Right.
So when something like a pandemic happens, it meant a lot of changes and very, very busy times for the union.
Where is a union, where does it become like I mean, that's sort of one of them is, you know, when there's I was thinking, where do they become cumbersome or more difficult? Like, what are some of the downsides that a system, not so much an employee or an employer, but where does the system get slowed down by a union?
I mean, of course, I don't think there's a lot of downsides. Of course, there's a potential for a downside, as in any organization. You know, sometimes the leadership of an organization stops listening to its members they're supposed to represent and becomes corrupt in some way. But I don't think that's anything unique to unions. That can happen in any organization. So we hear about those things where there's basically, you know, people doing bad things in unions, but that's not a problem with the union per se. And the other criticism that I've heard is that unions are built very much on seniority, that if you've worked somewhere for 25 years, that you should have some kind of priority over someone who's just started working there. And we call that seniority, and it's a concept that's sort of embedded in labor relations and how unions relate to employers. So that's been criticized in the sense that it's felt like it's discriminatory towards younger or newer workers. And so, you know, without getting into naming any details, there are some times when I think unions can be criticized for prioritizing the rights or the entitlements of the more senior workers with greater seniority rather than the younger workers. But we're all governed by the Ontario Human Rights Code, which applies across, like, it's a piece of legislation that takes priority over any other piece of legislation or the collective agreement, so that we can't negotiate collective agreements which are discriminatory to others on the basis of the grounds covered in the collective agreement, so on race or age or anything like that. But seniority is still a value that's enshrined in most collective agreements. And so that comes under some critique, but it's, you know, I think that unions, of course, are still interested in protecting, or have a responsibility to protect the rights of all of their members, even the ones that have just started, but within the confines about, you know, if you're choosing between two members, say for a vacant job, if everything else is equal, and so that's the big if everything else is equal, most collective agreements would say that you'd pick the person with greater seniority rather than the person with less seniority. So that's a concept that's up for some debate, but I think it's still a concept that's defended by everybody in the labor movement.
Interesting.
We had a discussion last week on campus. It was a conversation about faculty associations, and it turned out that every single question from the floor was about unionizing. And I don't think it was organized as a panel about unionizing, but every question from the floor was about pros and cons and process and how, how do we unionize? And one thing that I thought was really interesting, we've been talking about either we have collegial governance at the university or we have a union, and we been resisting unionizing because we love our collegial governance system. And the panelists said that's a false dichotomy. You can create a union that supports the processes of collegial governance. And I just wondered if that's something you've thought of, if that's a dichotomy we should be worrying about, or what do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I think that whoever said that that's a false dichotomy is correct, that it doesn't have to be two different things. You can go to any unions like Constitution and you can enshrine in there the principles you want to enshrine. And it should be in writing, enshrined in the Constitution, because you can't always rely on a current culture to sort of continue into the future as people transition, like move on and aren't there anymore, unless it's written down and encoded, you can't rely on that to stay. But I think that there's a lot you can do, if you're setting up a new union, or you can also join an existing union, and that's maybe harder to imprint the style of governance you want on an existing union. But particularly if you're starting a new union, I mean, a union is something that's recognized in law as the sole collective bargaining agent. That's all there is, right? It's codified in the Labor Relations Act in terms of what a union does and what they're able to do in collective bargaining. But there's no reason that you can't have whatever governance model that you would like. And unions are governed in a diverse number of ways. Like when I talk about to compare the two unions I've worked for, ONA has many different smaller locals, like say for each major hospital or a community health center, they have smaller locals. But ONA as an organization is province-wide with a similar number of members to our local, whereas UFCW is organized differently, and we belong to a national union and an international union, and the national union does a lot more organizing and doesn't service the membership in the same way that our local does. So our local is very large, like Local 175 covers basically the province and has the same number of members, or if not more now than ONA does as an overarching provincial union. So even though we're a local, we're not a provincial or national union. I've been told that our local membership is the largest in all of North America, actually. So we're very large. So our internal organization is different or varies across unions, and some of the way that the values, like I would say that UFCW is known for very much servicing the members. The reps go into the workplaces and are very much aware of what the membership, what their concerns are, and files grievances. And other unions, I think, maybe file less grievances or take fewer grievances to arbitration, or aren't as known for providing as much active servicing for their members. So unions can vary, and it can certainly, that kind of collective governance that you're talking about can certainly be part of how you decide to proceed as a unionized organization.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I really appreciate your comment about you can't always count on the current culture moving forward, because I think we've seen examples of governance that's built on good faith and relying on respect for one another, and then when that doesn't show up, then your governance might fall apart.
Yeah, and you can like, that's the Human Rights Code is there, for things like if you want to enshrine something like anti-racism or respect or a harassment-free environment. But even if you don't have that enshrined in your documents for your organization, the Human Rights Code is there and it supersedes anything you have. But if there's something about working collectively that's important to you and your governance style, I think it should be, the practice of even agreeing on how to describe that is a good practice, right? Because to write that down is a process. Like, how do we put into words what it is that we value about what we have here? and the practice of writing that down is a good one. And then you have it enshrined, but even enshrining is probably the wrong word, because it sounds like it's sacred or something, because it should also be a living document. You should be able to go back to it and review it and renew it every few years.
Yeah, that's really smart.
It's like a strategic plan or something that you
Mhm.
revisit.
And I guess you don't revisit a constitution, so it depends on what level document it is. Or you don't revisit a constitution very often, but I think any organization has to be open to change and moving forward in that way.
I want to shift just a little bit. We're a leadership podcast and you lead a team. And I'm just curious, the phrase herding cats comes to mind when I think of leading a team of lawyers. Like, what are some of the things that you think about for yourself as a leader, as you're leading your team?
Another good question. I think that it's the first thing I think about right off the bat is that it's my job to make sure that the team has all the tools and resources they need to do their job well, right? So I spend a lot of time thinking about that to make sure that they have, some of the physical resources like legal search engines, or that they know how to find information if they need it, and that kind of thing. But also, making sure that they have specialized training if they need it, or that they have an environment where they can come together and ask questions when we have team meetings, things like that. But it's also learning, I think that it really requires a leader to know their team really well and know what works for them and what doesn't, because it's my job even to assign them cases. And the cases as they come in and I have to assign them to counsel, any of them could do it or theoretically could do it, but some of them might have more of an interest or a passion in some kind of case. Some of them might have more of an aversion to a particular kind of case, or more familiarity with certain kinds of cases. So you really have to know your team in terms of what their interests and skills are and preferences are, as well as how they perform their work. Some of them, there's just lots of things to take into consideration, as well as balancing workloads and things like that. So there's that. And then I think one of the things that I'm learning right now, because I have a fairly new team, is, and this is hard to teach or to show, but to really encourage the team or empower them to be an advocate, because you want to take on a case and you don't want to say, well, gee, this case doesn't have much of a chance of success, because sometimes our cases don't have much of a chance of success. But our role as a union as a whole is to hold the employer accountable. And sometimes that means just taking them to arbitration and having them explain why it is they're doing what they're doing. Even if they eventually win the right to keep doing what they're doing, at least they've had to come and explain in front of an arbitrator why they've made that decision that the workers aren't happy with. And maybe they'll continue to be unhappy, and the employer will win the case in the sense of being able to keep doing what they're doing, but at least we've had them be accountable about it. Like sometimes it might be about a change in technology where all of a sudden they're tracking, say you're a driver for a company, and all of a sudden they've started tracking everywhere you drive and everything you do, and the workers don't like that, so we file a grievance, and maybe we lose the grievance, but at least we've made the employer give their rationale and their reasonings for why they're doing this and be accountable to someone about it. So what I try to do as a leader is let the lawyers know that I don't care if they win or lose a case, that it's a win just to take it forward to arbitration, and it's getting that sense of what the role is as an advocate.
That I think I'm really touched as you say that, just the idea that you're going to speak for people. And it does, like, I mean, I've been in my share of lawsuits over the years, and I don't know if anyone ever wins a lawsuit. Like it's always a painful process, but the idea that you get to speak and have someone have to listen and have to respond is powerful. And so I'm just really touched by that advocacy piece. And as a leader, like that you're helping orient your team to the fact that that's the value is also incredibly powerful. So I'm really touched by what you just said.
Yeah, it's for someone who's a new lawyer, it's sometimes a bit of a difficult lesson because you want to go in and you want to win the cases, and you have to recalibrate what it is to win, right? Because sometimes what it is to win is just saying, you know what, I'm giving this person a chance to speak, or I'm costing the employer lots of money to hire their lawyers to go to arbitration and explain themselves. You know, sometimes those are the wins. It's not that your grievance is actually sustained. You look for the wins where you can find them, or you look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, what else, Mel?
Well,
Is
I was interested in this idea of your assigning cases based on people's interests or skills or experience. Are there any feedback loops? Do you ever get to hear whether your case assignments were on the mark or not?
Yeah, I mean, you know, from the individual lawyers, and sometimes from you know, other people involved, like the other reps or directors in the organization, and sometimes sometimes I'm limited by who I have available, and so, you know, it is what it is. But yeah, I mean, sometimes they're not on the mark, in the sense that even timeliness is a question, right? Some lawyers are just able to complete some tasks quicker than others. So there's lots of considerations. But yeah, I guess the feedback loops, as you call them, are a little bit informal. Like, there's lots of things we can measure. We can measure how quickly a case goes forward. It's harder to measure actual satisfaction, or the kinds of wins I'm talking about. That's much more intangible and informal. We could measure we do measure timeliness, you know, how long it takes a case to go through the system, but that doesn't always tell the whole story. And of course, we celebrate our wins, you know, when we get someone back to work who's been terminated, because that does sometimes happen, or when we get someone back on LTD. You know, I personally won a case like that. It took 6 or 7 years from start to finish. It was a long process, one of the longest ones that I've ever been involved in, the longest one. Or, you know, there's other sort of remarkable wins we've had, and we celebrate those. But a lot of them are more these intangible feelings about, you know, we've accomplished something here that's not always easy to measure. And of course, we have interest arbitration too for some of our units that can all go on strike, so that when they can't agree on wage rates and things like that in collective bargaining, we go to an arbitrator, and we're having more and more success with those cases as well. Of course, it's in that sector, in the healthcare sector, like in long-term care and retirement homes, some of our members, not all of them, have been impacted by the dampening effect of Bill 124, where there was a 1% cap. And of course, that's been repealed. The government's repealed it after they took it to court. But it will be a long time, if ever, that those workers who had their wages capped during those years will have to play catch up for a long time.
I have a question for you. You talked about like workplace harassment. You said that word multiple times. I was wondering if you could talk about just generally what some of the kinds of harassment that you see regularly in the workplace. I think we use that word, we think we know what that means, but you actually have, you know, boots on the ground experience around this. And I'm curious, what are some of the common harassment issues that you see?
Well, I think you're right that the word is used very, very commonly to mean very different things. So under the Human Rights Code, it's going to be harassment based on some kind of grounds that are protected by human rights. So sexual harassment, racial harassment, you know, anything that's a protected ground. I think sometimes in the workplace, people use the term harassment over broadly, like it might be their manager harassing them to do something when it's really just a performance issue. You know, that person is being told, you know, you have to come to work on time, you have to do this, you have to do that. And it's not sexual harassment, it's not racial harassment, but the worker might call it harassment by their manager. So the first task of a union representative, you know, whether it's the steward in the workplace or the rep, is really to sort out what's going on here. Is it really harassment? Is it something else? Sometimes it's some form of favoritism or discrimination where one worker is being treated differently than the other, and we might call it harassment, but it's still not based on any of the grounds of the Human Rights Code. It's not sexism, it's not racism, it's some kind of what I'd call favoritism, for lack of a better word. And so the lawyer, or whoever's looking after the case, whether it's starting with the steward and then the rep and then the lawyer, really have to figure out what's going on here. And sometimes it's if someone is disciplined or terminated for some kind of behavior, and they're saying, but I'm the victim here because I've been the victim of harassment. And those are problems that are difficult to solve. And it's probably the reason why a good 75 to 80% of the people that we have that are terminated, we say to them, or they come to believe and agree with us that it's better to take some kind of severance package and go away and find another workplace, because this place has become so dysfunctional, so toxic, at least in terms of their experience, that rather than staying and trying to fix it and making it a harassment-free zone, it's just easier to move on somewhere else. I mean, but it doesn't fix the problem. So I think we hear a lot about harassment because it is a very difficult problem to fix. And we now have mandated under occupational health and safety law that if there is something going on in the workplace that amounts to harassment, there's an obligation on the employer to investigate it. But then having investigated it, I mean, it's great to have that obligation by law to investigate when there's harassment happening in the workplace, but it's then what are the action items to fix that, to change it going forward? That's the real problem, right? That's where the work really begins. And there's not a lot of easy answer on that. And I probably mentioned it once or twice because it is one of those questions that keeps coming up again and again and again, because there are no easy answers, and you have to work through it on a case-by-case basis and saying, what is the best way to solve this problem? And sometimes for the individual, as I said, the answer is to leave the workplace, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem for the next person.
I have a question for you that's just sort of a general question. What's the timeline like, either human rights tribunal or a human rights claim from in like when it happens to some kind of resolution? What do you know about that?
Oh, quite a bit, and through no fault of their own, because there's some good people who work at the Human Rights Tribunal, but it's a provincially funded organization, and the provincial government, currently Doug Ford and the governments before him, have systematically gutted it, so that they just don't have the resources. Like we have hearings, like we have a hearing coming up in April, which is a Human Rights Tribunal hearing for a matter that was filed in 2018. That's the kind of timeline we're talking about. And they're slow, and again, it's through no fault of their own. They're just a really, really systematically underfunded organization. And so when you want to talk about what difference a union can make, the reason I know quite a lot about it is that some of our union members say, oh, no, thanks, I'm not going to have the union file a grievance. I'll try my luck at the Human Rights Tribunal. And I'm actually, working on trying to disseminate word to our members about the pros and cons. I mean, sometimes, if like, I'm not going to stop anyone who wants to go to the Human Rights Tribunal, they have that right, but it's almost always a slower process. Well, it always is a slower process. A grievance arbitration, sometimes it takes longer than we would like to get it to grievance, but to get arbitration, but it's going to be a lot faster than the current rates of the Human Rights Tribunal. And the other thing is, for a grievance, you're going to have representation by a union lawyer. You don't have that at the Human Rights Tribunal. You go on your own, and you can use the services of the Human Rights Legal Services Center, but most people go unrepresented, or they have to hire their own lawyer out of their own pocket. There's other pros and cons. But because the Human Rights Code is something that supersedes all areas of law, including collective agreements and labor law, I've heard it said, and I remember it really caught my attention at the time I heard it said, is that most human rights law in Ontario is being made not by the Human Rights Tribunal, but by labor arbitrators. Because in terms of the volume of cases that go forward that are considering human rights principles, the largest volume of those cases are being decided by labor arbitrators, not by the members of the Human Rights Tribunal.
That's really interesting. I feel like we're do you have one more question, or do you feel like we could?
I was just going to say, yeah, I was going to say you've had a really interesting career, and it occurs to me that it would be really meaningful and fulfilling to have a career that's based in values. And I think it looks like that's what you've done. You've just been motivated by the values you've held, and then therefore this career has unfolded, which is really fantastic.
Sometimes at this point in our podcast, we ask people like, where can people find you? Like if they have a product to sell. I don't know if you want people to find you. I don't know if you want more connections or, people that ask you questions, but if you do, I want to give you that opportunity.
Well, when you work for a union, you're not looking for clients, and that your client is one client, which is the union. So no, I'm not looking for clients, but I'm very well. I'm not hard to find in the sense I'm out there on social media, and I'm not hard to find. And I just want to say to Mel's point, I mean, I consider myself very fortunate in that every day I go to work, and I have lots of flexibility and autonomy in my work life, but also lots of meaning. I feel assured that I'm working on issues that have real impact and real meaning in people's lives, and that keeps me motivated. I still do sort of some activist activities, but yeah, most of them are, I don't need to. I mean, I like to be well connected in community because I think that's essential to move any community work forward. But I don't need to be seen as a highly visible person. I'm there as, in preparation for this podcast. One of my favorite quotes came to mind. It's from Lao Tzu, and I'll probably screw up the quote, but it's basically, when your work is done, the people will say we've done it ourselves. And that has always been my highest sense of what being a leader is all about, is that you want to provide the tools and resources and the mobilization for the community to get where it needs to go, but you don't need to be on a pedestal to do that, so that when the work is done, the people will say we've done this ourselves. And that's the kind of leader I aspire to be. So I don't necessarily need people to be knocking at my door. I need people to be out there and doing the kind of work that they want to do to change the community and change their workplace, change their society in whichever ways they think it needs changing.
Thank you so much for being here, Jane. It's been such a pleasure, and I've learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Thanks.
See you again soon, I hope.
Yeah, I hope we see you soon.
I hope that you're enjoying my show. And if you'd like to take a look at my book, The Experimental Leader, Be a New Kind of Boss to Cultivate an Organization of Innovators, I have a special deal for my podcast listeners. Go to book.experimentalleader.com and you can get a digital copy of my book for just $4.95. I hope you love it as much as I loved writing it. And I hope it helps you create your first experiments.
Wow, that was super interesting talking to Jane about all of that. What were you taken by?
That was a really interesting conversation. One of the things that struck me from a leadership perspective was having to tell her lawyers when they've won, because they're going into a conflict, and you have this preconception that winning means that the opponent has been defeated. But in fact, she has to tell them, no, if you've opened up a conversation, if you've made sure your client has been heard, you've created an opportunity to understand why the other side is doing what they're doing, like those are wins. And winning may not look like you thought it would. So and I thought that was interesting, framing that as leadership, making sure they know, no, actually you won something here. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was this idea of just, I commented that her whole career has been motivated by her values and consistent with her values. And I think that's a really fulfilling way to have a career.
Well, and I was really taken by this idea of feedback loops. So I even just like on the big, meta scale, that arbitration it's a feedback loop for the employer. And it's a structured, mandated set of feedback loops so that there is a dialogue between employees and employer. And I hadn't thought about it exactly in that way. So winning or losing, it's still a feedback loop, which is probably more valuable than winning or losing. So I was really struck by that.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a great day with you, Mel. It's great to see you. And go experiment.
Go experiment. Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Experimental Leader. We hope you have found value in today's episode because we're dedicated to helping you become the experimental leader you want to be. To access the show notes or learn more, visit melanieparish.com. Go experiment!